Jonas Mercer had lived in the mountains long enough to know what belonged and what did not. The ridges and valleys had carved themselves into his memory as deeply as the lines on his face. And after 7 years of exile, he had come to trust the silence more than any human voice. So, when the silence broke one gray morning with the sound of hooves, his first instinct was to reach for the rifle that lay across his knees. The horse stepped from the mist like a shadow given flesh. It was a Mustang, black as coal dust, its coat streaked with sweat and blood, its breath a cloud of steam in the thin mountain air. Jonas froze, his chest tightening. He knew this horse. He had seen it collapse by the river 3 days ago, its body torn and broken, its eyes glazing with the unmistakable dullness of death. He had walked away from that carcass, certain it would never rise again. Yet here it was, standing at the edge of his camp, staring at him with eyes too alive, too knowing to be explained by anything he understood. For 30 years, Jonas had made his life among horses and mountains. He had broken wild stallions, traded Mustangs to army outposts, read the weather in the twitch of an ear or the stamping of hooves. He had never seen a wild horse step toward a man without fear. This one did. Its eyes did not show aggression or submission, but something different, an intelligence edged with desperation. It lowered its head, teeth finding the sleeve of his worn coat, and tugged gently, as if urging him to follow. Jonas pulled back instinctively. The horse did not release. Instead, it planted its hooves and tugged harder, dragging him half a step toward the northern pass. Jonas shook free and raised his rifle, not to shoot but to ward it off. The Mustang snorted, ears flicking back, then moved sideways, blocking his path back to the fire. It herded him the way a sheepdog might herd a stray lamb, insistent, deliberate. Only then did Jonas notice the marks around its neck. Raw rope burns dug deep into the flesh beneath its mane, still red and swollen as if the bindings had been torn free only hours before. Beneath the tangled hair, he glimpsed something else, a strip of leather darkened with age. He reached forward cautiously and pushed the mane aside. A collar lay hidden there, carved with symbols that made his stomach turn. 3 circles intertwined, a star in the center. His hand trembled. He had seen those markings before, carved into the blackened doorframe of the cabin that had burned 7 years ago, the night everything he loved had been taken from him. He staggered back, breath caught in his throat. The horse followed, eyes never leaving his face, as if it knew what he had recognized. Jonas cursed under his breath. He had sworn never to speak to another soul again, or let the past dig its claws into him again. But here it was, scratching at his door like a wounded Mustang that should have been dead. The fire cracked behind him, sending sparks into the damp air. Jonas wanted nothing more than to sink back onto his log, to pour another tin cup of coffee, and let the world outside the valley go to hell without him. But the horse would not allow it. Again, it took his sleeve in its teeth, gentler this time, pulling toward the treacherous paths where snow lingered even in summer, where hunters vanished and never returned. Wild horses do not behave this way. They do not seek men out. They do not lead them anywhere. Jonas tried to convince himself it was delirium from the thin mountain air, or the ghost of his guilt-given form. Yet the horse's warmth against his arm was genuine, the dampness of blood seeping into his coat sleeve undeniable. He glanced at the wound streaking its flank. At first, they looked random, the sort of savage cuts left by a whip or knife. But as his eyes traced the lines, a pattern emerged. They formed angles, paths, and intersections, like a crude map carved into living flesh. His stomach clenched. Someone had done this intentionally, hurt the creature just enough to keep it alive, desperate enough to seek help, then turned it loose with its body carrying directions. Jonas swore again and turned his back. He had buried his past, buried his name, buried the man he once was. He owed nothing to anyone, yet the memory of fire refused to stay quiet. He saw again the flames consuming the cabin, the figures trapped inside, the night sky filled with screams. The collar's carved symbol burned behind his eyelids. He could almost smell the smoke again, feel the ash in his lungs. The horse stamped the ground, a sound like an impatient drumbeat. When Jonas faced it again, it had stepped closer, close enough that he could see the whites of its eyes and the quiver in its nostrils. The desperation there was not animal instinct alone. It was something more that made the hair on his neck stand on end. With a weary curse, Jonas slung his pack over his shoulder. He checked the rifle, more out of habit than intent. His instinct screamed at him to stay in his sanctuary, to let the world's troubles bleed out in some distant canyon. But another instinct, buried under 7 years of silence, stirred to life. He could not let the creature suffer alone. He could not ignore the signs burned into its body, signs that linked too closely to his own nightmares. He stepped forward. The horse turned immediately, limping toward the narrow trail that climbed out of his valley and into the northern passes. Jonas followed, each step heavier than the last, every breath laced with the bitter taste of inevitability. The trail narrowed, sheer cliffs rising on either side. Above them, only a strip of gray sky remained. The horse stumbled, then pushed on, leaving droplets of blood on the stones behind it. Jonas's eyes traced those droplets and imagined others following them, hunters or killers, or worse. His chest tightened. He had not spoken to another human in years, and now, against his will, he was being led straight back into the world he had fled. The Mustang moved faster as the canyon bent, urgency in every step despite its wounds. Jonas tried to slow it, but each time he hesitated, the animal circled back, nudging, pushing him onward. His boots scraped on the rock, echoing between the canyon walls like reluctant footsteps of a man being dragged toward judgment. At last the canyon widened, spilling them into a valley Jonas had never seen. It lay hidden behind stone ridges, like a wound split open in the mountain's flesh. Tall walls surrounded it, broken only by the narrow gap they had just passed through. The place reeked of secrecy, something concealed from the world's eyes. The horse collapsed the moment its hooves touched the valley floor. Jonas dropped to one knee beside it. The wounds were deep, but not immediately fatal. Whoever had carved the map had known precisely how much pain the beast could endure without dying. Jonas pressed a hand against the blood-matted hide, anger rising in his chest. Whoever had done this had not only tortured an animal, but had used it as a message, a lure. Why me, he wondered. Why bring the horse to my camp? Why drag me here after all these years? He was still kneeling when movement in the shadows caught his eye. His rifle swung up automatically, steady despite the years of disuse. From behind a cluster of rocks stepped a woman. Her dress was torn, her dark hair wild, her face smudged with dirt and fear. In one hand she clutched a knife, in the other the hand of a child. The girl could not have been more than 8, her eyes too old for her small face, her silence heavier than the mountains themselves. The woman's gaze fixed on him with recognition. "You are Jonas Mercer," she said, her voice carrying the weight of certainty. He had not heard his name spoken aloud in 7 years. It sounded foreign, as if it belonged to another man entirely, one who had died in fire and loss. Jonas's grip tightened on the rifle. "How do you know that name?" he asked. Blackmail stepped closer, her knife still raised, but her voice steady. "Because we sent the horse," she said. "We have been waiting for you." Theirs hung in the thin air, heavier than stone. Jonas felt the old life he had tried to bury clawing its way back, felt the pull of the past dragging him into the valley's heart. The Mustang stirred weakly at his side, blood dark against its hide, its duty unfinished. Jonas stared at the woman and the child, at the valley that should not exist, and knew his silence had ended. The dead horse had returned, and with it, so had his ghosts. Jonas Mercer stood frozen, his rifle steady though his hands ached from its weight. The woman's words hung in the air like smoke refusing to clear. "We sent the horse." The notion was absurd, and yet the evidence breathed raggedly at his side. A Mustang that should have been long dead now collapsed on the ground, its hide carved with wounds too deliberate to be random. The child clung to the woman's dress, her wide eyes fixed on Jonas. She said nothing, not even a whimper, but her silence carried the weight of something seen that should never have been seen. Jonas lowered his weapon slightly but kept his finger near the trigger. The woman stepped forward, her knife still raised, though her voice softened. "My name is Elena Cross. This is my daughter Mara. We have been waiting for you." Jonas shook his head. "You do not know me." "I do," she said. "Everyone else may have forgotten, but not us. You were the horseman of 3 territories, the one people whispered about. And you were Clara's husband." The sound of his wife's name cracked through Jonas like lightning through a dry pine. Clara. He had not spoken it aloud in years, had not dared to let it form even in his thoughts, fearing it would unravel what little remained of him. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. Elena lowered the knife an inch, though her hand still trembled. "Clara was my cousin. Before the fire she wrote to me and told me I should seek you in the mountains if anything happened. She believed you would not die as easily as they wanted you to." Jonas staggered back a step, his heel striking the rock behind him. The fire returned to him in flashes, the cabin lit like a lantern against the night. Clara's screams swallowed by the roar of collapsing beams, the scent of pine pitch and charred flesh. He had buried that night beneath layers of silence, but Elena's words freed it like a splinter torn from skin. He forced himself to focus on the present. "Why the horse? Why these wounds?" "Because they were hunting us," Elena answered. "They would never let us reach town. Everyone there belongs to Lucian Ward. If we walked into the streets with proof, we would vanish before we reached the sheriff. So I did the only thing left. I marked the horse with the path to this valley, cut shallow so it would live, and let it find you." Jonas turned his eyes to the Mustang. Shadow breathed in shallow bursts, its eyes rolling with exhaustion. The collar beneath its mane glinted where he had brushed away the hair, the carved symbol staring back like an old curse. He crouched and touched it again. "You carved this too." "Stormed no," Elena said quickly, stepping forward. "That was already there when I found the horse. That symbol belongs to them, to wardsmen. They mark what they own, people and animals alike." Jonas traced the lines of the symbol, 3 circles interlocked around a star. His chest tightened. He had seen this once before, burned into the door of his cabin after the fire. He had thought it the work of drifters or cruel children. Now he knew better. Mara tugged on Elena's sleeve, her small finger pointing toward the symbol, as if even she recognized its meaning. She still did not speak, but the intensity in her gaze made Jonas shift uncomfortably. He looked into her eyes and saw not fear, but memory. A child's recall of horrors no child should carry. Elena's voice broke into his thoughts. "They killed my husband, Jonas. They killed him because he found the deeds, the forged claims, the maps showing which homesteads Ward intended to burn next. He buried the evidence here before they caught him. Mara saw them do it. She has not spoken a word since." Jonas felt the old weight pressing down on his chest. He wanted to walk away, to climb back through the canyon, and vanish into the solitude he had carved for himself. But the horse had dragged him here for a reason, and the reason now stared at him with wide, unblinking eyes. He glanced around the valley. The walls rose steep and sheer, unbroken stone that caught every sound and threw it back in echoes. Only one way in or out. The narrow gap they had passed through. A stronghold if defended well, a death trap if enemies pressed hard enough. And his thoughts, because she nodded grimly.
"They are coming."
The morning dust rose on the horizon. 3 riders, maybe more behind them.
"By nightfall, they will reach this valley."
Undermined clenched his jaw. Why me? Why not run south and find another settlement or sheriff?
"Because the sheriff rides for Ward. The innkeeper serves him meals. The pastor takes his gold, and the townsfolk keep their heads down. You are the only man within 100 miles who owes him nothing, who has nothing left to lose."
Her words struck like a hammer. Nothing left to lose. He had shaped his entire life around that truth. Yet hearing it from her lips was different. It was an accusation, a challenge. The Mustang stirred, trying to rise, its legs trembling. Jonas pressed it gently back down. The animal was finished, its duty complete. He looked up and met Elena's eyes. She stood tall, despite her torn dress, her knife still clutched, though her hand bled from gripping it too tightly. Mara pressed close to her side, silent as a shadow. Jonas exhaled slowly. If Ward's men are coming, we have little time. Elena's gaze sharpened. You will help us then? I have not held a rifle against a man in 7 years. Then you have had 7 years to remember how, she said. Jonas said nothing, but in his chest something shifted. The silence he had wrapped around himself for so long began to crack, letting in voices, memories, demands. He did not want them, yet they came. The horse had dragged them back into him, just as it had dragged him into this valley.
Nia's sharp whistle cut across the wind. Jonas turned his head and saw a faint cloud of dust rising in the distance, carried through the narrow pass. The riders were closer than Elena had guessed. He felt the air tighten, the mountains holding their breath. Mara pulled at her mother's sleeve again, her mouth opening silently. She pointed toward the pass, her small hand shaking. Jonas rose to his full height, rifle in hand. His voice rasped from years of disuse, but it all carried authority. Get behind the rocks, both of you. Elena did not argue. She grabbed Mara's hand and pulled her toward the shadow of the valley wall. Jonas knelt beside the boulder nearest the entrance, steadying his rifle against the stone. His hands did not tremble. Some skills never faded. The Mustang gave a final shuddering breath at his side, then lifted its head, eyes meeting his with a look that seemed almost human. Jonas pressed a hand to its neck. Rest now, Shadow. You brought me here. That is enough. The sound of hooves echoed closer, a rhythm of menace against stone. Jonas narrowed his eyes at the narrow slit of the canyon. The past he had buried was riding toward him, and there would be no turning away this time. Behind him, Elena whispered to Mara, her voice urgent but steady. Jonas could not hear the words, but he felt their weight. The girl clung tighter to her mother's side, her gaze fixed on the canyon mouth, where shadows lengthened. Jonas adjusted the sights of his rifle, breathing even, body still. He had lived as a ghost for 7 years, a dead man. Now the living world was coming to claim him, bearing the same symbols that had haunted his nightmares. Symbols carved in ash, symbols carved in flesh. He would meet them here. He would meet them all. His shoulder against the cold stone, his rifle cradled steady as the first echo of approaching riders reached the valley. The rhythm of hooves carried through the canyon like a drumbeat, announcing danger long before the men themselves could be seen. His eyes shifted toward the Mustang, Shadow, lying motionless on the ground. The wounds etched across its hide still gleamed wet in the fading light, each one deliberate and carrying a meaning Jonas had not yet deciphered. The thought gnawed at him. The horse was more than a victim. It was a message. Antagonmouth remained quiet, except for the steady thud of hooves. Jonas's breathing slowed, muscles taut but controlled, and 7 years of solitude had not dulled his instincts. His body remembered how to wait, measure distance by sound, and steady a heartbeat before a shot. He turned his gaze to Elena, and Mara crouched further behind the rocks. Elena's face was pale, but her eyes shone with something other than fear, resolve. The child clutched at her mother's sleeve, still silent, her small body pressed tightly against the stone. Jonas forced himself to focus. He leaned closer to Shadow and let his hand glide over the scarred hide. At first glance, the cuts were a tangle of brutality, cruel slices inflicted to torment. But as his calloused fingers traced them, a pattern began to emerge. Lines converged into angles, curves suggested trails. It was a crude cartographer's sketch carved into living flesh. He saw the ridges of the northern passes, the split of the canyon, and then the valley itself etched into the horse's side. A map. His chest tightened. Someone had carved this precisely, knowing the horse would live long enough to deliver it. But why send it to him? Why choose Jonas Mercer of all men, a hermit who had cut ties with the world? He closed his eyes briefly, and the answer returned unbidden. They knew he would not ignore a wounded animal, because the scars of his own past mirrored the ones cut into the horse. The hoofbeats drew closer. Jonas rose into a crouch and braced the rifle against the boulder. Dust filtered through the narrow canyon mouth, swirling in the dying light. Shadows stretched long across the rocks. Then came voices, low, and sharp. "She's trapped in there," one of the riders said. The words carried clearly. "The horse blood leads straight inside." Another voice answered, edged with caution. "Could be a trap. The woman's clever enough. She stole what doesn't belong to her." A third voice, deeper, confident. "Boss wants it finished." The girl saw too much. Both of them did. "No one leaves that valley alive." Jonas exhaled slowly. If he could send men deep into these mountains, Lucian Ward's reach was long. Jonas adjusted his grip and sighted the first rider as he emerged from the canyon mouth. A pistol gleamed in the man's hand, his eyes scanning the rocks with a predator's patience. He moved like one who had killed before, but not with the discipline of a soldier. Jonas recognized the type. Hired muscle, dangerous, but not invincible. Jonas waited until the rider's gaze passed over him, then leveled the rifle square at his chest. His voice, rough from disuse, cut through the stillness. "Drop the gun." The man froze. His head turned, eyes locking on Jonas. Surprise widened them, followed quickly by calculation. He let the pistol slip from his hand to the ground, but his other hand hovered too near his belt. Jonas's finger tightened on the trigger. "Tell your men to back away," Jonas ordered. "Can't do that," the man said with a thin smile. "The woman's got papers, proof, things that'll hang powerful men. The boss won't let that see daylight." Elena's voice rang out from behind the rocks, clear and fierce. "Proof that your commissioner has been killing homesteaders, stealing their land, and selling it to the railroads? My husband died trying to stop him." The rider's smile turned cruel. "Your husband died because he couldn't mind his business, and you'll die the same way." Before Jonas could react, movement streaked across the valley floor. Mara broke from her mother's side, running straight toward a mound of stones near the spring. Her small hands clawed at the earth with frantic determination. "Get the girl!" a voice roared from the canyon mouth. Jonas's heart lurched. Another rider urged his horse forward, pistol drawn. Jonas fired. The shot cracked through the valley, echoing against the stone. The bullet struck the ground inches from the man's boots, a warning rather than a kill. Jonas surged forward, seizing Mara by the arm and pulling her behind cover. She clutched something tight against her chest, dirt-streaked and wrapped in oilskin, the packet. Prosecuted and third riders surged through the canyon, weapons raised. Gunfire erupted, chips of stone exploding near Jonas's head. He shoved Mara behind him and dropped into cover, returning fire rapidly. Elena moved like a woman accustomed to survival. She grabbed a rock the size of her fist and hurled it with unerring aim. It struck one rider across the temple, sending him sprawling. She darted forward, seized his fallen revolver, and crouched behind another boulder, her movements sharp and practiced. The Mustang stirred again. Shadow staggered to its feet with a scream that echoed like thunder and charged at the nearest rider. Hooves lashed out, forcing the man to reel back and fire wildly. Jonas's shoulder burned as a bullet grazed him, spinning him halfway around, but he steadied himself and returned fire, forcing the man to dive for cover. Chaos reigned in the valley. Mara clung to the packet, her wide eyes darting between her mother and Jonas. Elena crouched behind cover, revolver ready, her dress torn, but her focus absolute. Jonas felt the old rhythm surge back into his veins, the heat of battle, the calm within chaos, the clarity of knowing life and death balanced on each breath. Neither riders regrouped, spreading out to flank them. Jonas cursed under his breath. These were not random thugs. They knew how to press an advantage. From the canyon mouth, the deep voice called out again. "Give us the papers and we'll make it quick. No need for the child to suffer." Jonas's gaze flicked to Mara. Her small hands tightened on the packet, her silence louder than any scream. He thought of another child, another night, another fire. When he had failed to protect those who needed him most. His grip on the rifle hardened. Not again. Elena's reply rang out, sharp as a blade. "If you want them, come and take them." The riders spurred forward, gunfire tearing through the valley once more.
Jonas moved from cover to cover, firing with deadly precision. Elena's revolver barked, each shot deliberate, forcing the men to duck and weave. Bloodied but unbroken, Shadow hurled itself again and again into the fray, a living wall of defiance. Jonas caught a glimpse of Elena as she reloaded, her jaw set, her movements quick and sure. He realized then he had underestimated her from the start. She was not merely a desperate widow, but a fighter forged in fire, as stubborn as the mountains themselves. Mara tugged at Jonas's sleeve, her finger pointing toward the far wall of the valley. Behind a curtain of rock and spray, a thin trail disappeared into shadow. Another way out. Jonas's mind raced. If there was a passage, why had Elena not used it earlier? Unless she had needed him here, needed a man who could fight, a man the horse could lure. Gunfire sparked again, stone chipping near his head. Jonas dropped low, firing back. His voice growled across the rocks. "Stay close. Do not move until I tell you." The riders pressed harder, one of them shouting to circle. Jonas steadied his breathing. The scars on Shadow's hide burned in his mind, the symbol on the collar flashing like fire. Nothing about this was chance. Everything had been carved, planned, orchestrated to bring him here. The packet in Mara's hands, the proof Elena risked everything to save. The enemies closing in. All of it pointed to a single truth. The past he had fled for 7 years had caught him at last, and it had chosen this valley as the place where his silence would end. Jonas rose from cover, rifle steady, eyes fixed on the men who came to kill them. The time for hiding was over. The valley air had thickened with gunpowder smoke, each echo of a shot rolling against the stone walls until it seemed the mountains themselves were groaning. Jonas Mercer crouched behind a jagged boulder, the stock of his rifle warm from repeated fire. His shoulder throbbed where the bullet had grazed him, but the pain was secondary. A dull drum beat behind the sharp clarity of survival. He forced his breath steady, eyes cutting from shadow to shadow, calculating where the next rider would emerge. Near behind him, Elena Cross and her daughter Mara clung to the stone wall. Elena's grip on the revolver she had seized was firm, though Jonas saw the tremor in her wrist. Yet her eyes betrayed no fear. They were sharp, unflinching. The eyes of someone who had long ago learned that terror was a luxury the hunted could not afford. Mara pressed herself against her mother, small hands clinging to the packet of oilskins she had unearthed from the earth. Her silence remained unbroken, but her gaze flicked constantly between Jonas, her mother, and the mouth of the canyon. Another shot cracked from the ridge. Jonas ducked, splinters of rock biting at his cheek. He rolled to the side, sighted, and squeezed the trigger. His bullet clipped the edge of the canyon wall, forcing a rider to pull back with a curse. The man's horse reared, screaming before bolting back a few yards. The moment's pause gave Jonas time to reload. Elena crouched beside him. "You cannot hold them alone," she said, her voice low but steady. "I have done more complex things," Jonas replied, his eyes never leaving the rocks. "Not for anyone else," she said sharply. "Do not lie to yourself. You would not still be here if that were true." Jonas turned his head slightly. Their eyes met. In hers, he saw exhaustion, grief, and a fire that reminded him of Clara, the woman he had lost 7 years ago. He swallowed hard and looked away. The fight was not over, and sentiment was a weight he could not carry now. Thus came a bellowing voice. Silas Kane, leader of the riders, spoke in a tone dripping with confidence. "Hand over the papers and the girl walks away. Keep them, and the ground will drink all your blood." Elena shouted back, her words clear and cutting. "If you want them, come and take them yourself." Jonas risked a glance. 3 riders were spread along the canyon, 2 firing in intervals while Silas hung back, orchestrating their movements. These men were not amateurs. They were Ward's hounds, disciplined enough to probe weaknesses and patient enough to bleed them dry. Jonas understood then that the narrow valley, which initially had seemed a fortress, was a coffin waiting to be sealed. A sudden movement pulled his attention. Shadow, the Mustang, lurched once more to its feet. Blood streamed down its side, yet the animal stood defiantly, its body shaking with the effort. Jonas's chest tightened. The horse was dying, but its spirit refused to surrender. It stamped the ground, nostrils flaring, then staggered toward the line of riders. The distraction was enough. Jonas took the opening, fired, and clipped one rider's arm. The man screamed, dropping his revolver, and his horse bolted into the rocks. Elena seized the moment, quickly rising from cover and firing 2 shots. One struck close enough to another rider's boot to send him tumbling from the saddle. The valley fell briefly silent, except for the harsh breathing of men and horses. Jonas reloaded, and his movements were smooth, despite the tension in his muscles. His gaze flicked again to Elena. She was crouched low, revolver steady, and Mara shielded behind her body. For the first time since the fight began, Jonas felt the faint stirrings of something he had buried deep. Trust. He crawled closer. When this breaks, we run for the far wall. The child showed me a passage behind the falls. Elena's brow furrowed. That way is dangerous. It is narrow, dark, and unmarked. My husband found it before they killed him. It is still a way out, Jonas replied. Stay here and we die. Before Elena could answer, Mara tugged at her sleeve and pointed urgently at the canyon mouth. Jonas followed the direction of her finger and saw the glint of steel. More riders were coming. Silas had not come with only 3. He had brought reinforcements. Jonas says stomach dropped. He had expected a skirmish, not a siege. The sound of hooves thundered louder, filling the canyon with the rhythm of inevitability. Elena's voice trembled for the first time. We cannot hold them, Jonas. Jonas closed his eyes for half a second, hearing Clara's screams in the fire again, feeling the weight of failure pressing into his chest. No, not again. He opened his eyes, jaw clenched. Then we do not hold. We break them. Undermined in a single motion, rifle cracking twice rapidly. The shots rang true, dropping one rider and scattering another. Elena followed, her revolver barking, her aim surprisingly precise. They forced the first wave of riders back toward the canyon mouth. Silas Kane's voice cut through the chaos. Fall back. Do not waste yourselves. Hold them in place. The boss wants the papers intact. Punishable. Hooves echoed like fading thunder. For a moment, silence reclaimed the valley. Jonas dropped to one knee, sweat streaking his dirt-smeared face, his hands reloaded by instinct, his mind already spinning through possibilities. Elena crouched beside him. They will not stop. Ward will not stop. He cannot afford to. Jonas met her gaze. Then we do not wait for him to come. We take the fight to him. She studied him, the faintest glimmer of something like respect crossing her face. Mara leaned into her mother, her small frame trembling, though her eyes fixed on Jonas. There was no fear there, only expectation. Jonas looked down at the packet clutched in Mara's hands. Oilskin worn, edges frayed. Yet whatever lay inside had the power to bring men like Lucian Ward to send killers into the mountains. He felt its weight, even from a distance. It was not paper he saw, but fire, ash, the faces of Clara and the child he had lost. He could not fail this one. The silence of the valley thickened once more. The riders had not gone far. They waited beyond the canyon mouth, preparing for another push. Jonas knew their patience was long, their resolve absolute. They would grind him down, piece by piece, until nothing remained unless he chose otherwise. He turned back to Elena. Gather what you can carry. When the next wave comes, we use the chaos to break the waterfall. Elena hesitated, then nodded. Her eyes lingered on him a moment longer, as if measuring the man who had stepped from exile to stand between her and the men who wanted her dead. Jonas reloaded again, the metallic click echoing in the valley like a promise. He had hidden long enough. He had buried himself among the peaks, convinced silence would keep the ghosts at bay. but ghosts had found him regardless. Now they wore the faces of riders, the name of Lucian Ward, the brand of a symbol cut into a horse's hide. The woman and the child were more than fugitives. They were a reckoning. And Jonas Mercer, whether he willed it or not, had been chosen to stand at the heart of it.
The hoofbeats began again, closer this time, accompanied by the harsh shouts of men. Jonas lifted his rifle. Elena steadied her revolver. Mara pressed the packet tight to her chest. The valley braced for the storm. And after 7 years of silence, Jonas Mercer prepared once more to fight. The second assault began with the smell of dust. Jonas Mercer's senses caught it before his eyes did, a dry tang carried on the mountain wind, the promise of hooves grinding the earth into powder. He crouched low behind the jagged stone at the valley's entrance, rifle steady, breath slow, his body already anticipating the storm. Beside him, the black Mustang shadow shifted weakly, its sides heaving, blood still seeping in dark rivulets down its flanks. The horse had given more than any creature should be forced to provide. Jonas placed one rough hand against its neck. "Stay down," he muttered, though some stubborn part of him knew the animal would not. The canyon mouth darkened as riders spilled through in a rush. Jonas counted 5 this time, not 3. Their pistols gleamed in the last light of the day, their shouts rising like wolves howling on the hunt. Elena Cross and Mara huddled deeper in the rocks behind him. Elena's revolver was drawn, her jaw set, eyes sharp. Mara pressed the oilskin packet against her chest like the fragile bundle shielded against bullets. Jonas waited, patient as stone. The first rider burst through, his horse lathered, his pistol rising. Jonas fired once. The crack echoed across the valley walls. The rider toppled from his saddle, dust blooming around him. Chaos erupted. The remaining 4 fanned out, one circling wide to the left, another dismounting and taking to the rocks. Elena fired, her shot striking close enough to make a second rider wheel his horse in panic. Jonas shifted position, his body moving with a fluidity he had not felt in years. Each breath was measured, and each movement was precise. The long-buried instincts of the man he once had been returned, as if they had been waiting for this moment all along. A shot grazed the stone inches from his head. He dropped low, rolled, and fired back. The dismounted rider yelped and fell, clutching his leg. Another surged forward, reckless, hoping speed would make up for aim. Jonas met him head-on, his bullet tearing through the man's shoulder and spinning him sideways in the saddle. Through the din, he heard Silas Kane's voice again, commanding, urging, venomous. "Pin them in, wear them down. The boss wants the girl alive." The words turned Jonas's blood to ice. He glanced back. Mara's eyes were wide, locked on him, silent but full of a trust that burned heavier than any chain. Elena kept her revolver steady, her gaze unyielding, but Jonas saw the strain etching lines at the corners of her eyes. Shadow surged suddenly to its feet, staggering like a drunk, but its scream split the valley air. The horse charged, hooves pounding, teeth bared. It collided with one of the riders before Jonas could stop it, sending man and beast tumbling into the dust. Gunshots cracked wildly. One bullet slammed into Shadow's flank, and the horse reeled but did not fall. It struck out again, hooves catching the dismounted man in the chest with a sound that silenced his cries forever. Jonas felt something twist inside him. The Mustang was no longer just a creature caught in someone else's war. It was a warrior, carrying scars that were maps and an unbroken will. Jonas lifted his rifle and fired into the chaos, covering Shadow's retreat as the horse stumbled back toward the spring at the valley's center. The riders regrouped. 3 still pressed forward, cautious now, eyes wary of rifle and Mustang. Jonas counted his ammunition and grimaced. Too few rounds left. The canyon was filling with twilight, the rocks casting longer shadows, each one a potential place for an enemy to hide. Elena crouched beside him. "We cannot hold them much longer," she hissed. Her hand brushed the revolver cylinder, confirming what Jonas already knew. Her bullets were running out too. "Then we do not hold them," Jonas replied. "We bleed them and move. The waterfall." Mara tugged at her mother's sleeve, nodding vigorously, her small hand pointing again toward the hidden path at the far wall. Jonas met the child's eyes. For the briefest moment, he saw a flicker of something almost supernatural there, a clarity far beyond her years, as if she had already seen the course of events unfold. Another shout came from Silas Kane. "Enough of this! End it!" The riders charged together, hooves shaking the ground. Jonas rose, rifle cracking, his shots deliberate, slowing but not stopping them. Elena fired her last 2 rounds, the sharp reports ringing defiance before the gun clicked empty. She hurled the weapon aside and grabbed a fallen pistol from the dust, her movements seamless, survival honed by desperation. The fight was a blur. Jonas dropped one man with a shot to the thigh, and Elena winged another. But the last rider broke through, galloping straight toward them, pistol leveled at Elena. Jonas pivoted, too slow, his rifle empty. The man's grin split his face as he squeezed the trigger. Shadow hurled itself between them. The bullet struck the horse's chest with a sickening thud. The Mustang screamed but kept coming, slamming into the rider and tearing him from the saddle. They hit the ground together, a storm of dust and fury. When the dust cleared, Shadow stood trembling, blood pouring, but the rider lay still. Jonas dropped to his knees beside the horse. Shadow's breath came ragged, shallow. Its eyes found his, blazing with that desperate intelligence that had first drawn him from exile. He pressed his forehead against the animal's neck, whispering words he had not spoken to anyone in years. "You brought me here. You did your part." Elena's hand gripped his shoulder. "Jonas, we have to move." He looked up, his vision blurring with rage and grief. Beyond the canyon, more riders waited, their silhouettes dark against the fading sky. Silas Kane had not committed all his men yet. They were toying with him, bleeding him slow. He rose, teeth clenched. Not tonight. He gathered his pack, slung his empty rifle across his back, and took Mara by the hand. The child did not resist. Elena kept close, her eyes scanning the shadows. Together they moved across the valley floor toward the far wall where the waterfall tumbled in silver ribbons down the stone. The roar of water masked the sound of approaching hooves, but Jonas knew the riders were close behind. Near they reached the spray, the rock slick beneath their boots. Mara pointed to a narrow crack behind the falling water. Jonas pushed Elena and the girl toward it. "Go, now!" Elena hesitated. "What about you?" "I will hold them," he said, his voice low and resolute. "No," she snapped, fierce even in fear. "You hold them with us, together." The child's eyes met his, wide and imploring. Jonas's chest tightened. He nodded once. Then all three slipped behind the curtain of water, vanishing into the dark passage beyond. The waterfall's roar swallowed the valley, but above it came the sound of Silas Kane's laughter, carried on the wind. "Run, hermit, run while you can. There is no place in these mountains where we cannot find you." Jonas stoned, the echoes of water pounding in his ears, the heat of the packet pressed between them all. He knew Silas was right. There was no more hiding, no more silence. The blood trail had already begun and would not end until Lucian Ward himself was brought down. The Mustang's scream still lingered in his memory, both a cry of pain and defiance. Jonas swore to himself that it would not be in vain. The darkness closed around them as soon as they passed through the curtain of falling water. The roar of the cascade dulled every sound, turning their footsteps into whispers, swallowed by the echoing stone. Jonas Mercer led the way, one hand trailing against the damp wall, the other holding his knife ready. His rifle was empty, slung across his back, its weight a bitter reminder that bullets were now scarcer than hope. Behind him, Elena Cross guided Mara carefully through the narrow passage, her free hand gripping the packet wrapped in oilskin that had already cost too many lives. The air was thick with moisture, cool and heavy, carrying the scent of moss and stone. Water dripped from the ceiling, pattering against their shoulders. The passage narrowed, then widened suddenly into a cavernous chamber. Jonas raised his hand, signaling silence, though none had spoken since entering.
He listened, body tense, every nerve alive. No pursuit yet. The waterfall masked their trail well. But Silas Kane and his men would not be far behind. Mara squeezed between her mother and Jonas, her small fingers brushing against his hand. Jonas glanced down and met her wide, solemn gaze. Still, she said nothing, but in her silence was something uncanny, as though she carried knowledge beyond her years. He gave her a single nod before moving deeper into the cavern. The floor sloped downward, slick with algae. Their footsteps left faint prints in the moisture. Elena's breath came ragged, though her voice remained steady when she finally spoke. "How much further?" Jonas shook his head. "I do not know. You said your husband found this path. Did he mark it?" Elena looked away. "He spoke of it only once. He believed it was an old miner's tunnel, abandoned decades ago when the veins ran dry. He said it could be an escape if ever we needed one. Then they killed him before he could show me the rest." Her voice wavered for a moment, but she steadied it quickly. Jonas heard the steel beneath the grief. He respected that. Grief was a weight. Steel was a weapon. They pressed on, their shadows flickering against the stone as Jonas lit a torch from his oilskin pouch. The flame sputtered, then flared, pushing back the dark. The walls glistened with mineral veins, quartz catching the light like stars embedded in stone. It gave the cavern an eerie beauty, a reminder that even in the earth's bowels, something still shimmered. Mara tugged at Elena's sleeve, then pointed deeper into the tunnel. Jonas followed the gesture with his eyes and saw faint marks etched into the rock, almost invisible beneath the moss. He crouched, brushing the surface with his thumb. Carvings.
"Nee, what is it?" Elena asked, leaning close.
Jonas traced the marks, circles interlocked with a star at their center, the same symbol that had been carved into Shadow's collar. His jaw clenched. Ward's men had been here. This path was not unknown to them. It was part of their territory. Elena's face paled as she recognized the symbol. "Then they can follow us?" Jonas stood slowly, his hand tightening on the torch. "They will, which means we must be faster." They continued deeper, the tunnel twisting through the earth like a serpent. At times it narrowed so much that Jonas had to turn sideways to pass. The torch held high above his head, his shoulders scraping damp stone. Elena and Mara followed closely, their breaths quick in the confined space. At one point the child stumbled, nearly dropping the packet, but Jonas caught her arm and steadied her. She looked up at him with those wide, unblinking eyes, and for a moment he felt the weight of her trust pressing heavier than his own guilt. Near the passage opened into another chamber, this one littered with remnants of old mining equipment. Rusted tools, rotting beams, and broken carts lay scattered like bones of another age. Jonas moved cautiously among them, scanning for signs of recent use. Dust lay thick on everything, disturbed only by the faint prints of small animals. No human had been here in years. Relief flickered briefly, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the riders would not give up. Elena crouched near an overturned cart, her fingers brushing something half buried in the dirt. She pulled free a scrap of parchment, brittle with age, but still legible. "Maps," she whispered. "Mining maps." Jonas took it from her, holding it near the torch. The lines were faint but clear enough. The tunnel stretched for miles, twisting through the mountains. Some ended abruptly, others led to hidden exits. His eyes followed one line that wound toward a mark near the surface. It might be a way out. He folded the parchment and slipped it into his pack. Then he caught sight of something else scratched into the wall behind the cart. Newer than the old maps, fresher, the cuts still sharp. Words, hastily carved. "Beware the river of stone." Elena read them aloud, her voice hushed. "What does it mean?" Jonas shook his head. He wanted to leave a warning. Consider it further, a sound rolled faintly through the tunnel. Distant, but growing hoofbeats echoing against the stone. Jonas's blood ran cold. They had followed. He doused the torch quickly, plunging them into darkness. Elena stifled a gasp, pulling Mara close. Jonas listened intently. The hoofbeats reverberated strangely, distorted by the twisting tunnels but unmistakable. Silas Kane's men were inside. Jonas whispered low, "We move." No sound, no light. He led them through the wall, guided by memory of his glimpsed map.
Each step was careful and deliberate. Their only sounds were breathing and the occasional water drip. The hoofbeats grew louder, softer, then louder again, as if the riders were fanning through multiple passages. Suddenly, Mara tugged hard at Jonas's sleeve. He froze. The child pointed into the darkness ahead, though Jonas could not see what she saw. He trusted her instinct nonetheless, and shifted their course toward a narrow side passage. They squeezed through just as the glow of torches flickered faintly in the main tunnel behind them. Voices echoed, rough and cruel. "She's here somewhere. Ward wants the papers. Keep searching." Jonas pressed Elena and Mara deeper into the side passage until the voices faded. They emerged into another chamber lit by a faint natural glow filtering from above. Jonas saw a crack in the ceiling where moonlight spilled through. A fissure too narrow to climb, but proof they were closer to the surface. Elena exhaled shakily. "We cannot keep running forever." Jonas studied the fissure, then the tunnel ahead. "No," he agreed. "We will not run, but we will choose where to fight." Mara pressed the packet tighter to her chest, her silence more eloquent than any words. Jonas looked at her, then at Elena. The woman and the child were more than fugitives. They were a cause, a reckoning. And Jonas Mercer, broken hermit of the mountains, had become their shield. Mikhail tired his grip on the knife, listening again to the faint echoes of pursuit. The riders were close. The tunnels gave them both advantage and danger. Somewhere ahead lay escape or death. Behind the waterfall had only been the beginning. Wildfires was far from over, and Jonas knew the blood trail would lead them deeper still before it ended. Fiberglass sloped downward into a heavy silence that even the sound of their breath seemed intrusive. Jonas Mercer guided Elena and Mara with one hand against the cold wall, the other gripping the hilt of his knife. The torch remained unlit. Light would betray them, and sound carried too easily through these cavernous veins of the mountain. Every few steps he paused, listening for the faintest echo of pursuit. The hoofbeats had faded for now, but he knew better than to trust the quiet. Silence in the earth was rarely mercy. The floor grew uneven, shifting from damp stone to jagged ridges that jutted like broken teeth. Jonas slowed, his boots slipping on loose shale. He raised his hand to halt Elena. She steadied Mara with both arms, the child clutching the packet so tightly her knuckles gleamed pale in the dim. Jonas crouched, touched the ground, and realized the stone beneath them was fractured in strange, unnatural ways, like once liquid and then frozen mid-movement. He remembered the words carved into the wall back in the chamber. "Beware the river of stone." Neath came alive before him now. The tunnel widened into a cavern that stretched far into darkness. Across its center lay a vast field of rock, frozen into waves, ripples, and jagged folds, as if a river of molten earth had surged and then died in place. Moonlight filtered faintly from fissures above, silvering the peaks and troughs, revealing a treacherous path forward. Jonas tested one step. The stone groaned under his weight, shifting slightly. His jaw clenched. It was not solid. Beneath this hardened surface, something hollow yawned. One false step and the crust might collapse, plunging them into depths unknown. He turned back to Elena. "We cross carefully, one at a time. Follow my path exactly. No mistakes." She nodded once, her face pale but resolute. She tightened her grip on Mara's shoulders. "Do as he says, not a sound." Jonas began forward. Each step was deliberate, his boots seeking the ridges where the stone felt firmer. The cavern stretched wider than a battlefield, shadows dancing across the undulating surface. Behind him he heard the faint scrape of Elena's boots, the softer patter of the child. He did not look back. Looking back meant hesitation. And hesitation was death on stone like this. Halfway across, a faint rumble trembled beneath their feet. Jonas froze, hand raised. The sound swelled like a living thing. The groan of a mountain unsettled, then silence again. He exhaled slowly. "Move," he whispered, his voice little more than air. They continued, weaving across the stone river until the far wall loomed closer. Hope flickered, but it died quickly as the faint glow of torches appeared in the distance behind them. Voices carried faintly, distorted but unmistakable. Silas Kane's riders had found the same path. Jonas's heart pounded. Speed meant risk, but delay meant capture. He pressed forward faster, the stone cracking faintly beneath his boots. Elena followed, her jaw tight, Mara clinging to her hand with white-knuckled determination. The child never cried or whimpered, but Jonas could feel her fear in how she pressed close to her mother. Then it happened. A sharp crack split the air. Jonas whipped his head around in time to see part of the surface collapse beneath Elena's trailing foot. She yanked Mara forward just in time, the girl tumbling onto firmer ground as the rock behind them caved inward, swallowing a section of the path. The hollow roar that followed sounded endless, like a chasm without bottom. Dust billowed upward, choking the air. Jonas reached back, seizing Elena's arm, hauling her forward before the collapse could spread. Her chest heaved, eyes wide, but she steadied quickly. They pressed on, the collapse echoing behind them like a warning bell. The torches were closer now. Shouts rang out. The riders had seen the collapse, and still they advanced. Jonas cursed under his breath. These men feared Ward more than death. That made them dangerous beyond measure. At last, the far wall rose above them, slick with moisture where underground streams trickled through cracks. A narrow ledge climbed upward into shadow, promising escape. Jonas shoved Elena and Mara toward it. Climb, do not stop. Elena hoisted Mara first, pushing the girl upward until she found purchase on the stone. Jonas braced them from below, his muscles straining as he lifted both mother and child higher. Mara scrambled nimbly, her small hands gripping tight. Elena followed, teeth gritted, hauling herself despite exhaustion. The first bullet ricocheted off the stone near Jonas's head. He spun, knife flashing, though too far from his rifle to return fire. The riders had reached the river of stone, their torches glowing like hungry eyes in the dark. Jonas ripped his empty gun from his back, using it like a staff. He swung it against the first man who tried to leap across the fractured path, sending him sprawling into a trough. The man screamed as the rock beneath him cracked and gave way, his body vanishing into the abyss. The other riders hesitated then, their torches flaring as they spread out across the treacherous surface. Jonas climbed after Elena and Mara, each motion urgent, every breath burning in his chest. He reached the ledge and pulled himself up, just as another bullet sparked against the wall. The passage narrowed again, curving upward. Jonas caught Elena's arm, helping her steady Mara. They pressed deeper, away from the cavern and its deadly stone river. Behind them, the echoes of pursuit grew fainter, but Jonas knew it was only temporary. The riders would not abandon the chase. They emerged into a small chamber lit by a shaft of moonlight from above. The air was fresher here, the scent of pine and earth filtering in. Jonas dropped to his knees, chest heaving, sweat streaking his face. Elena slumped against the wall, her hand still clutched around the packet. Mara sat silently beside her, eyes reflecting the pale glow, her silence once again unsettling in its calmness. Jonas studied the child for a long moment. She had watched the collapse, had seen men vanish into the abyss, yet her eyes held no tears, only a strange knowing, as if she had expected it all along. He felt a chill deeper than the mountain air. This child had witnessed horrors no soul should carry, yet she bore them like a prophet in silence. Flooring Elena spoke at last, her voice hoarse. They will not stop, not until Ward himself is dead. Jonas nodded slowly. Then we do not run any more. We make our stand. Elena's gaze sharpened. You would fight him after all these years of hiding. Jonas looked toward the moonlight, visible through the crack above. I was already dead. Shadow brought me back. That horse gave everything to drag me into this. I will not waste the gift.
The silence stretched. Elena reached out, placing her hand lightly on his arm. Then we fight together. Mara finally moved. She placed the packet in Jonas's lap, her small hands lingering as though entrusting him with more than paper. Jonas stared at it, then at the girl. Her eyes burned with the same desperate intelligence he had once seen in shadow. He felt his chest tighten. The horse and the child, both had led him here. The faintest echo of hoofbeats rolled once more through the tunnels behind them. Jonas clenched his jaw and rose to his feet. The stone river had spared them, but the battle was still ahead. And when it came, Jonas Mercer would no longer be the hermit of the mountains. He would be the weapon fate had been carving all along. The mountain air hit them like a slap when they finally pushed through the narrow fissure and emerged onto the outer ledge.
The tunnel spat them out, high above a forested gorge. The moon hanging silver over the ridges, clouds drifting like restless spirits across the sky. Jonas Mercer pulled Elena and Mara close against the rock face, his chest rising and falling with the effort of their escape. The waterfall roared behind them. The stone river lay hidden deep in the earth, yet the pursuit still echoed faintly in the passages below. There was no rest, only a brief pause in a long flight. The ledge was narrow, treacherous, the drop sheer into blackness. Jonas led the way, his hand brushing the rock wall, boots testing each step before shifting his weight. Elena followed with Mara pressed against her side. The child's eyes gleamed pale in the moonlight, unblinking, her silence a constant weight that pressed on Jonas's thoughts. He had seen hardened men break under less, yet this girl carried her burden without a sound. It made him uneasy, and bound him to her more tightly than any words could.
As they moved slowly, the sound of distant wolves rising from the forest floor far below. Jonas paused, scanning the tree line. A light flickered between the branches. Torches. His jaw tightened. Ward's men were circling, hurting them. The mountain was vast, but Ward's reach was long, and the hunters had become practiced in driving quarry into their chosen traps. Elena saw it too. Her hand tightened on Mara's shoulder. "How many?" "Too many," Jonas said flatly. "Enough that we cannot outrun them by staying on these ridges." "Then where?" Jonas scanned the cliffs, his eyes adjusting to the play of moonlight and shadow. He spotted a narrow cut in the rock leading upward toward a stand of pines clinging stubbornly to the slope. Higher ground meant risk, but it also meant sightlines, and sightlines meant survival. "This way," he said, guiding them toward the cut. The climb was brutal. The stone gave little purchase, and the cold bit deep into their hands. Elena pushed Mara upward with fierce determination, Jonas hauling from above when the girl's arms began to tremble. The packet, lashed tight against Elena's body, weighed heavier with every step, though she refused to let Jonas take it. Her stubbornness burned in her eyes, the same fire that had kept her alive this long. At last, they dragged themselves onto the pine ridge. The trees whispered in the mountain wind, branches swaying like the arms of sentinels. Jonas guided them deeper into the grove until they reached a hollow where the earth dipped into shadow. He knelt, scanning the ground for tracks. None fresh. They had a moment, but only that. Submerged to her knees, Mara beside her. The child pressed close, her small face pale, her hands still gripping the oilskin packet, even though Elena had secured it. Jonas crouched opposite them, his face grim. They will keep coming until Ward has what he wants. "Then we destroy it," Elena said, her voice sharp with sudden desperation. "If the papers cost so much blood, they may not be worth saving." Jonas shook his head. "They are proof of the killings, the land theft, everything Ward has done. Without them, he wins, and all this is for nothing." Elena's jaw tightened. "My husband died gathering this." She looked down at Mara. She nearly lost her childhood to it. Jonas's gaze softened, but his voice stayed firm, so it must mean something. Otherwise, their deaths, their suffering, all of it is ash. The silence stretched,
broken only by the sigh of the wind through the trees. Mara looked between them, her small hands clutching the packet tighter, as though she understood more than either of them wished she did. Jonas turned his attention outlopes. The forest below was restless. Torchlight flickered once more, closer this time. The riders were climbing, their shouts carried faintly on the wind. He cursed under his breath. They had less time than he had hoped. "We need allies," he said at last. "Alone, we cannot hold against them." "There are none," Elena answered bitterly. "Ward owns the towns. He owns the law." "Not all the law," Jonas said. His mind turned to the memory of Jim Dalton, a marshal who once fought corruption before Ward's rise. If Dalton still lived, he might still stand for justice. But finding him meant leaving the mountains, leaving the exile Jonas had built around himself like armor. Elena's eyes studied him. "You know someone." Jonas did not answer. Instead, he rose, listening again. The hoofbeats were louder now, echoing through the gorge. Time was measured in heartbeats. He looked down at the girl. Mara met his gaze, her expression solemn, as if she had been waiting for him to decide. "Higher still. The ridge will give us a vantage." Harder than before. The pines thinned, replaced by bare stone and stubborn brush. The moon was swallowed by clouds, casting the mountain in shadow. They climbed by touch and instinct, Jonas leading, Elena pushing Mara upward with a strength born of desperation. The child moved silently, tirelessly, her will fierce despite her small frame. At the crest, they found a plateau, small but defensible. Jonas scanned it, stone outcrops for cover, narrow approaches. It was not a fortress, but it was ground they could hold. He turned back. Here. Glazed collapsed into the hollow, exhausted. Elena cradled Mara, whispering words Jonas could not hear. He checked his rifle and counted his remaining cartridges. Too few. He tested the edge of his knife, sharp but inadequate against rifles. They were cornered, yet he felt a grim calm settle over him. Hiding was over. The storm gathered below. The torches wound their way up the slopes like fiery serpents, the riders' shouts growing louder, more confident. Silas Kane's voice carried among them, mocking, promising, "You cannot hide, hermit. Ward will have the papers and the girl." Knee Elena stiffened, her hand clutching Mara tight. Jonas stood slowly, stepping to the edge of the plateau. He looked down at the torches climbing the mountain. He thought of Shadow's scream, of the horse's eyes before it fell. He thought of Clara and the fire 7 years ago, of the silence he had mistaken for peace. He turned back to Elena. "When they come, we break them, and then we go to Ward." Her eyes widened. "You mean to face him?" Jonas said, "I mean to end him." His voice steady, carved in stone. The first riders appeared on the lower slope, their torches casting grotesque shadows against the rock. Jonas lifted his rifle, sighted, and waited. The gathering storm had reached its peak, and the fight for survival, truth, and redemption was about to begin. Night closed in around them as the torches below wound higher, each flicker of fire a signal of encroaching doom. Jonas Mercer crouched low against the stone outcrop, his rifle balanced on the rock, eyes narrowed to slits as he counted shapes moving among the pines. At least a dozen, maybe more, riders climbing with grim determination, their voices carrying faintly in the mountain air. They had no intention of retreat. Ward's orders were absolute. Please bring back the child and the papers, and silence anyone in their path. Fiberglass, Jonas Elena Cross huddled with Mara in the shelter of the plateau. She cradled the girl close, whispering steadying words, though her face was pale in the shifting moonlight. Mara clutched the packet still, silent as always, her wide eyes fixed on Jonas's back as though she believed he alone could hold back the tide that climbed toward them. Jonas inhaled slowly, letting the air cool his lungs, steadying his pulse. The mountain hermit, the broken horse trainer who had fled from fire and guilt, was gone. What remained now was the soldier of survival, the man shaped by loss into something sharper than steel. He set his sights on the first torch that emerged from the tree line and squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked like thunder. One torch tumbled into darkness, the man who carried it falling with a strangled cry. Chaos followed, shouts rising, torches swinging wildly as riders scrambled for cover.
Jonas ducked back behind the stone, working the rifle quickly, the sound echoing across the ridge. He had only a handful of rounds, but every shot must count. He fired again, clipping another rider in the leg, sending the man crashing against the rocks. The mountain gave nothing easily, and those who fell rarely stood again. Return fire sparked against the stone, bullets whining through the air. Elena shielded Mara with her body, pressing the girl against the ground. Jonas pressed lower as shards of rock stung his face. They had rifles too, longer reach than his, and more ammunition. His advantage lay only in the ridge itself. Silas Kane's voice rose above the fray, harsh and mocking. "You cannot win, Mercer. Give us the girl, the papers, and perhaps I'll let you crawl back into whatever hole you came from." Jonas leaned just enough to fire another round, the bullet sparking against a torch that sputtered out. He shouted back, his voice carrying raw power. "You want her? Come and bleed for her." The silence was brief, broken by the thunder of hooves as a pair of riders tried to storm the slope. Jonas shifted quickly, fired, and dropped one man cleanly. Elena had seized a discarded pistol from earlier battles and fired two, her shot clumsy but true enough to spook the second horse, sending the rider tumbling backward. She lowered the gun, her breath sharp, her eyes fierce. Jonas gave her a brief nod. "Good. Stay low. Please wait until you see their eyes." The next wave came on foot, figures scrambling upward with knives and revolvers. The ridge narrowed, funneling them into a choke point, but they climbed with the desperation of men who feared Ward's wrath more than bullets. Jonas struck down one, then another, the rifle heavy but steady in his hands. He felt the weapon grow lighter with each shot, not because of strength, but because of dwindling ammunition. Soon it would be gone, and then there would only be steel and bone. Mara stirred for the first time, tugging at Elena's sleeve, then pointing toward the far side of the plateau. Jonas followed her gesture and saw shadows moving there too. Ward's men had split their force, circling to flank them. He cursed, grabbed Elena's arm. "With me." Together, they dragged Mara across the plateau to the far wall, where jagged stone rose high. Jonas pressed them into a cleft, turned, and braced for the assault. Two riders scrambled over the edge, pistols flashing. Jonas dropped one with a desperate shot. The other lunged forward, only to meet Elena's knife buried deep in his side. She shoved him back, her face set in grim determination, her breath ragged. The plateau rang with violence. Jonas fought like a man possessed, his knife flashing in the moonlight when his rifle ran dry. He drove steel into flesh, felt blood slick his hands, heard the cries of men who had underestimated the hermit of the mountains. Elena fought beside him, wild and fierce, her desperation turned into fury. Yet still they came. Silas Kane himself mounted the final slope, his figure broad and dark against the torches, his pistol gleaming like the fang of a predator. His voice cut through the night. "Enough of this, Mercer, you end tonight." Jonas stood at the plateau's edge, knife in hand, rifle useless at his side. His chest rose and fell with every heaving breath, his body aching with cuts and bruises. But his eyes met Kane's with a fire that refused to die. "You first," Jonas said. Neither men clashed violently, shaking the ridge. Kane fired once, the bullet grazing Jonas's shoulder, but Jonas lunged forward, slamming into him, sending the pistol spinning into the dark. They grappled, fists in fury, boots sliding against the stone. Kane was strong, a brute built on violence, but Jonas was leaner and more challenging, and his strength was forged from survival rather than indulgence. They crashed to the ground, rolling dangerously close to the edge. Elena screamed, but Jonas heard only the roar of blood in his ears. Kane's hands closed around his throat, choking the breath from him. Jonas clawed, fought, then drove his knife upward with every ounce of strength. The blade sank deep, and Kane's roar turned to a gurgle. He staggered back,
clutching at the wound, eyes wide with shock. Jonas rose slowly, chest heaving, blood dripping from his hands. He looked down at Cain. "Tell Ward I am coming," he said coldly. Then he kicked the dying man off the ridge.
Cain's body vanished into the darkness below, the crash of his fall swallowed by the mountain. The remaining riders, seeing their leader fall, hesitated. Some fled back down the slopes, their torches scattering like fireflies. Others fired blindly before retreating, fear overtaking loyalty. The ridge grew quiet again, the storm passing. Jonas staggered back to Elena and Mara. Elena's face was streaked with dust and sweat, her eyes blazing. Mara clung to her mother, but her gaze was fixed on Jonas, her silence deeper than ever. Jonas dropped to his knees, exhaustion pulling at every limb. The fight had been won, but barely. The cost was written in the blood on his hands and the bodies strewn across the plateau. Elena knelt beside him. "You saved us." Jonas shook his head slowly. "No, we saved each other. But this is not the end. Ward will send more. He will not stop until he has what he wants." Mara reached out then, placing the packet in his lap. Her small hand lingered on his, her eyes meeting his with unspoken urgency. Jonas understood. The siege had been only a prelude. The actual war lay ahead. He looked out over the dark mountains, torches fading in the distance, and felt the weight of destiny settle on him like the cold night air. The hermit had fought his battle, now the hunter must rise. Ward would not stop, and neither would Jonas Mercer. The dawn broke in streaks of crimson and gold across the mountain ridges, painting the stone peaks like the sky bled. Jonas Mercer stood at the plateau's edge, his body battered from the night's battle, his hands still raw from the fight with Silas Cain. The corpses of Ward's men lay scattered below, carrion for wolves and ravens. The mountain was quiet again, but the kind of quiet promised only a pause before another storm. Elena Cross sat beside Mara, brushing dust and ash from the child's tangled hair. The girl had finally slept, her small body curled against her mother's side, the packet clutched even in dreams. Elena's eyes drifted to Jonas, her expression unreadable. He had become something different in the night, no longer the hermit she had dragged from his solitude, but something more dangerous and frightening even her. Jonas broke the silence. "We cannot stay here. Ward will send more, and the ridge will not hold again." Elena's voice was steady. "Where then?" "To the only man who can stand against him, Marshal Dalton." The name hung in the cold air like a ghost. Jonas had not spoken it in years. Dalton was once a friend when justice was still possible in the territories. But Dalton had fought Ward before and lost nearly everything. If he still lived and wore the badge, he might be the last honest lawman left. Imprisoned's eyes narrowed. "You think he will help us?" "He must," Jonas said. "Without him, we have nothing but these mountains. The hills cannot shield us forever." They gathered what little they had. Jonas scavenged ammunition from the dead, reloaded his rifle with a grim efficiency. Elena armed herself with a pistol and a knife taken from Cain's men. Mara carried only the packet, its weight greater than any weapon. Together they descended from the ridge, their steps slow, careful, the silence between them heavy. The journey down the mountain was long and treacherous. The forest smelled of pine and blood, the ground littered with broken branches from the battle above. Jonas guided them through deer trails and dry creek beds, moving like a man who had once belonged to these lands. Every sound made him stiffen, every shadow seemed alive with pursuit. Yet no riders came. Ward's men were regrouping, waiting for orders. The real confrontation lay ahead. Blackmail they reached the valley floor where the old road wound toward the distant town of Cedar Ridge. Smoke curled faintly from chimneys in the distance, a reminder of the world Jonas had abandoned. He paused at the tree line, staring long at the place he had not seen in 7 years. The memories pressed heavily on him. The fire, the screams, the faces of Clara and their child, the weight of guilt that had driven him into exile. Elena placed a hand on his arm.
"You are not the same man who left."
Jonas shook his head. "I am worse." She held his gaze.
"No, You are stronger. That is what scares Ward.
Secure, they moved on. Mara holding tightly to Jonas's hand now. It startled him, the child's sudden trust, the way she walked beside him with quiet certainty. He had been no father for 7 years, yet here was a child who looked at him as if he were her only shield in the world. As they neared the town, Jonas pulled them into the cover of an abandoned barn. He peered through the cracks at the main street. Cedar Ridge had grown. New buildings crowded the old, showing Ward's wealth spreading like rot. At the far end of the street loomed the Brennan Land Commission office, its gold letters catching the last rays of daylight. Samuel Ward's empire. Bold and proud, daring anyone to challenge it. But Jonas's eyes were drawn to another building, older, weather-worn, yet still standing. The marshal's office. The shutters were cracked, the paint faded, but the badge hung above the door. He felt his chest tighten. Dalton was still here. They waited until darkness cloaked the town before moving. Jonas led them through back alleys, avoiding the patrols of Ward's hired guns. At last, they reached the marshal's office. Jonas knocked once, sharp and deliberate. A long silence followed, then the sound of boots on wooden floorboards. The door creaked open. Marshal Jim Dalton stood there, older, grayer, but with the same steel in his eyes. He froze when he saw Jonas, disbelief crossing his weathered face.
"Need Jonas Mercer," Dalton said slowly. "Thought you were dead."
"I was," Jonas answered. "Now I need your help."
Dalton's gaze shifted to Elena and Mara, then to the packet clutched in the child's arms. His jaw tightened. "Get inside, quickly." They entered the office. The air smelled of tobacco and old paper. Wanted posters lined the walls, many yellowed with age. Dalton closed the door, bolting it, then turned sharply to Jonas. "Speak." Jonas told him everything. The Mustang, Elena, Mara, the papers, Ward's men, and Silas Kane's death on the ridge. He spoke without embellishment, his voice low, steady, every word heavy with truth. Elena added her own testimony, describing her husband's murder, the land theft, and the terror Ward had unleashed. Mara said nothing, but when Dalton asked about her, she opened the packet and showed him the documents inside. Deeds, maps, letters, names of the dead. Dalton read in silence, his face growing darker with each page. At last, he looked up.
"This is enough to bury him twice over." "Then you will help us?" Elena pressed. Dalton's eyes flicked to Jonas. "I will. But understand this. Ward owns half the men in this town. He owns the courts, the judges, maybe even the governor. The only way justice will stand is if we make it undeniable, if we catch him in the act." Jonas leaned forward. "Then set the trap." Flooring studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Tomorrow Ward will expect his men back. When they do not return, he will grow anxious. He will send others or come himself to ensure the job is done. That is when we strike." Elena's hand tightened on Mara's shoulder. "And if he does not come?" Harold's eyes fight to him. The room fell silent, the weight of the coming battle pressing on all of them. Jonas looked at Mara. The child's eyes met his, calm and confident, as though she already knew the path ahead. He felt something stir inside him, something he thought had died with Clara and their child. The faint glimmer of hope. As the night deepened, Jonas sat at the window, rifle across his lap, watching the street below. The town slept uneasily under Ward's shadow. But for the first time in years, Jonas felt that the dawn might bring more than blood. It might get justice. And justice, he thought, was worth every wound, every scar, every ghost that haunted him. The town of Cedar Ridge woke restless beneath a sky the color of iron. Clouds hung low, pressing against the rooftops as if the heavens themselves crouched in anticipation. Jonas Mercer stood in the shadows of the marshal's office, his rifle resting against the window frame, his eyes fixed on the main street, where life carried on with a strained normalcy. Merchants opened their shops,
Women swept stoops and children ran between wagons, but beneath every action, Jonas saw the fear that Ward's men had sown into this town. It lingered in how conversations cut off when patrols passed by, eyes darted to the Land Commission building and then quickly away again. Marshal Dalton moved through the office with a heavy stride, precisely checking his revolvers and loading cartridges. He looked older in the gray morning light, lines carved deep into his face, but his hands were steady, his purpose unshaken. Elena Cross sat at the far table with Mara beside her, the packet of papers spread between them. Dalton had read them twice in the night, Jonas once, Elena countless times. Every page was a nail in Ward's coffin if they could keep the evidence safe long enough. Dalton set his revolver on the desk and straightened. Today we test him. He will not wait for his men. If he's half as arrogant as I believe, he'll come looking. Jonas adjusted the roller, and if he doesn't, Dalton's eyes were hard as flint. Then we drag him out. Elena looked up from the documents.
And how do you propose to do that with a man who owns every judge and sheriff from here to the river? Dalton answered by showing him the one thing he cannot own, his gaze shifting to Jonas, truth backed by a bullet if need be. Jonas said nothing. He had spent 7 years hiding from the truth, drowning it in silence, burying it in the ashes of his cabin. But the time for hiding had ended when the Mustang bled its way into his camp. He tightened his grip on the rifle. Then, let us set the stage. By noon, the plan was in motion. Dalton had sent word to a handful of townsfolk he still trusted, men and women who remembered when law meant something more than Ward's coin. They drifted into the street one by one, their movements casual, their expressions blank. But Jonas noted the way they lingered near alleys and rooftops, and their hands brushed too often against hidden weapons. The town was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when shadows turned into fire. Jonas was in the livery stable across from the Land Commission building. From there, he had a clear sight line to the wide porch where Ward often stood to address his men. The smell of hay and horse sweat filled his nose, grounding him in the present as much as it reminded him of Shadow, the black stallion that had died to drag him from exile. He forced the memory down, focusing on the task before him. Elena and Mara remained inside the marshal's office under Dalton's watchful eye. Elena wanted to fight, but Jonas insisted she stay with the child. The papers were the heart of this battle. Without them, everything else was only blood and ash. She had pressed her lips tight, her eyes burning, but she had not argued. Remotely, the hours dragged until afternoon shadows stretched long across the street. Then, Samuel Ward emerged from his building, as if summoned by the weight of their silence. He was taller than Jonas remembered, broad-shouldered, his expensive suit tailored to project wealth and power. 2 hired guns flanked him, pistols gleaming in the harsh light. He walked with the calm arrogance of a man who believed he owned the land and the people who walked upon it. Jonas steadied his rifle, drawing in a slow breath. He could end it now with one pull of the trigger. Ward's blood would stain the street and his empire would be chaotic. But chaos was not justice. Dalton had been right. They needed the people to see, to witness the truth. Otherwise, Ward would become a martyr to his own lies. Ward's voice carried down the street, smooth and commanding. "Where are my men?" His gaze swept the storefronts and windows as though he could smell rebellion. He raised his voice louder. "They rode into the mountains and did not return. Who here knows why?" The townsfolk shifted uneasily. No one answered. Jonas felt the tension coil like a spring. He saw Dalton step into the street, his badge catching the light, his revolver low at his side. Dalton said, "Your men won't be coming back," his voice cutting through the murmurs. "They're dead." Ward's eyes narrowed, but his smile did not falter. "And who killed them?" "You, older man." Dalton shook his head slowly. "Jonas Mercer." The name rippled through the crowd. Heads turned, whispers rose. Some swore under their breath, others crossed themselves. The hermit of the mountains, the ghost of the Hollister fire, had returned. Jonas stepped from the shadows of the stable, rifle across his chest, his face carved from stone. He walked into the street and stopped beside Dalton. Over him, recognition sparking. "Thought you were Ash, Mercer."
Fire is less thorough than I believed." Jonas's voice was quiet but carried. "You killed my family, you burned my home, and you will answer for every grave you left in these mountains." Ward laughed, the sound sharp as broken glass, big words from a hermit who hid while the world moved on. "You think these people will side with you? They eat from my hand." "Not today," Dalton said. "Today, they see the truth." He raised his hand. Elena stepped from the marshal's office, and then Mara was at her side, holding the packet of papers high. The crowd gasped, murmurs turning to shouts. Elena's voice rang clear. "These are the deeds Ward forged, the orders he signed, the confessions of his men, proof of the murders, proof of the theft, proof that the fire at the Hollister cabin was no accident." Ward's smile faltered, his eyes darting to the crowd, calculating. His hand twitched toward his pistol, but Jonas raised his rifle, the sight fixed squarely on Ward's chest. "Die before you draw," Jonas said flatly. The crowd surged then, voices rising. Some shouted Ward's name like a curse. Others called for his arrest. The hired guns looked uneasy, their grip on loyalty wavering in the face of so many eyes. Ward's mask of arrogance cracked, fury flashing in his gaze.
"You think papers will hang me?"
he snarled.
"You believe the word of a broken man, a widow, and a mute child will stand against me?"
He gestured, and suddenly gunfire erupted from the rooftops. Hidden men loyal to Ward unleashed chaos, bullets tearing into the street. Screams rang out, townsfolk diving for cover. Jonas grabbed Elena and Mara, pulling them down as wood splintered around them. Dalton fired back, dropping one shooter, his voice bellowing orders to the townsfolk to fight. The trap had sprung both ways. Jonas rolled to cover behind a wagon, Elena clutching Mara tight beside him. The packet had fallen in the dirt, but Mara snatched it desperately. Jonas fired back at the rooftops, his shots measured, precise. Dalton moved like a man half his age, rallying the people, firing with deadly accuracy. Position retreated toward his office, shouting commands, his remaining guards forming a shield around him. But Jonas had him in his sights. He fired once, grazing Ward's arm, sending him stumbling. The crowd roared as they saw their commissioner bleed for the first time. The fight raged in the street, but something had shifted. The people were no longer silent. They picked up fallen rifles, hurled stones, and fought against the men who had ruled them with fear. Ward's empire cracked in the light of day. Jonas reloaded, his eyes never leaving Ward. Vengeance alone. It was about ending the reign of a man who believed himself untouchable. And as bullets sang through the air and the town of Cedar Ridge became a battlefield, Jonas Mercer knew the final reckoning was close at hand. Shilm hung over Cedar Ridge like a shroud, drifting in lazy tendrils across the rooftops as the first light of dawn crept over the mountains. The street lay in ruin, bullet holes scarring storefronts, shattered glass glittering in the gutters, the faint scent of blood mixing with the acrid stench of gunpowder. Jonas Mercer stood at the center of it all, rifle heavy in his hands, his body bruised and torn, but his will harder than iron. Around him, the townsfolk slowly emerged from cover, their fear burned away by the fire of defiance. Marshal Dalton barked orders, rallying men to secure the streets and disarm the wounded loyalists who clung to Ward's pay. His voice was hoarse but steady, carrying the authority of law that had too long been silent. Elena Cross stood near the steps of the marshal's office, her arms wrapped protectively around Mara, the girl's small fingers still clutching the oilskin packet like a lifeline. Flooding had escaped the street in the chaos, his guards dragging him bleeding into the fortress of the Land Commission building. Now the three-story edifice loomed like a fortress of arrogance at the end of the road, its golden letters catching the light of dawn, defiant against the rising tide. Jonas's eyes locked on it with unyielding resolve. "He's cornered," Dalton said, stepping to Jonas's side. "But a cornered wolf is the most dangerous kind." Jonas spat blood into the dust. "Then we finish it before he has time to gather his teeth."
Imprisoned folk gathered, some armed with rifles, others with nothing more than farm tools or stones, but all with the same fire in their eyes. They had lived too long under Ward's shadow, and now the dawn called them to stand. Elena stepped forward, her voice carrying over the crowd. The papers prove everything, but proof means nothing if Ward walks free. If we end it here, today, Cedar Ridge will be free. Her words struck the crowd like sparks to kindling. A roar rose, voices once hushed, now demanding justice. Jonas raised his rifle high. Then we take the commission.
The assault began as the sun broke entirely over the mountains. Jonas led from the front, Dalton at his side. Elena and Mara protected behind a wall of determined townsfolk. Ward's gunmen fired from the windows, bullets whining through the air, splinters flying from the walls. Men fell, cries echoing, but the tide did not break. Jonas moved with relentless purpose, firing, advancing, dragging wounded men to safety, urging the rest forward. They reached the steps, the doors barred, iron reinforced. Jonas slammed his shoulder against them, feeling the wood groan but hold. Dalton gestured, and a group of men brought a wagon soaked in lamp oil. They rammed it against the doors, set it ablaze, the flames roaring, the iron glowing red until the barrier buckled. With a thunderous crash, the doors gave way, and the mob surged inside. The building was a labyrinth of polished wood and marble floors, built to intimidate and impress.
Now it echoed with gunfire and screams as Jonas and Dalton carved a path upward. Ward's men fought desperately, but their discipline fractured under the weight of the town's fury. Jonas fought grimly, his rifle cracking, his knife flashing in the close quarters. He had no room for hesitation, no space for mercy. Elena and Mara huddled with Dalton's deputies on the second floor, protecting the packet. Jonas pressed on, his heart pounding, each step heavier as he climbed toward the commissioner's office. The air grew thicker with smoke, the heat of the fire spreading through the building. The walls themselves seemed to tremble, as if the empire Ward had built knew its time was ending. At last, Jonas reached the grand office at the top of the stairs. The door was ajar, smoke curling from within. He pushed it open, rifle raised. Samuel Ward stood at the far end, blood staining his sleeve where Jonas's bullet had grazed him the day before. He held a pistol in one hand, but it hung low, his eyes burning not with fear but cold fury. "So the hermit comes down from his mountain to play hero," Ward sneered. "Look around you, Mercer. You think this rabble can hold what they've taken? You think law will stand without gold to feed it? Kill me, and another man will rise in my place. That is the way of power." Disregano stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath his boots. The dawn light poured through the shattered window, casting long shadows across the room. "You built your power on graves, on fire and ash. That ends today." Mercard raised the pistol, but his hand trembled. Jonas fired first. The shot slammed into Ward's chest, the impact driving him back against his ornate desk. Papers scattered like leaves in a storm. He gasped, eyes wide, blood spreading across his fine suit. He tried to speak for a moment, summoning one last boast, but no words came. He collapsed into his chair, his empire crumbling with his final breath.
Silence fell. Jonas lowered his rifle, his chest heaving, the weight of 7 years pressing down on him. The fire crackled in the hall, the sounds of fighting below already fading. The war was over. Dalton entered moments later, revolver in hand, his eyes scanning the body before settling on Jonas. "It's done." Jonas nodded slowly. "It's done." Together, they carried Ward's body into the street. The townsfolk gathered, their voices hushed now, their faces pale with awe. Elena and Mara stood at the front, the girl's eyes fixed on Jonas with a mixture of fear and reverence. Dalton raised his voice, loud enough for all to hear. "Samuel Ward is dead. His crimes are proven. Cedar Ridge is free." A cheer rose then, rolling like thunder through the streets, a sound born not of vengeance, but of release. The people embraced, wept, and shouted their joy. For the first time in years,
The weight of fear had lifted. Jonas looked at Elena, Mara, and the townsfolk's faces. He saw not victory, but responsibility. Freedom was fragile, and justice required more than the death of a tyrant. It required guardians. Elena approached him, her eyes soft, though her face was streaked with soot and blood. "What will you do now?" Jonas looked toward the mountains, their peaks bathed in golden light. "I went there to die. Now I must learn how to live." Mara tugged at his sleeve, her voice small but steady. "You will stay. You will protect us." Fiberglass knelt to meet her eyes. "Always." Josel placed a hand on "Will need you." "I can wear the badge, but the law is only as strong as those who stand for it." Jonas rose, the weight of his decision settling over him. "I will stand, not just for them, but for all the graves left behind." The sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the smoke. The townsfolk began to rebuild even as they celebrated, their laughter and voices rising into the morning air. The Land Commission building smoldered, a monument to greed reduced to ash. Jonas walked among them, no longer the hermit or the man who had fled from fire. He was something new, forged in blood and sorrow, but tempered by hope. He was their protector, witness, and mountain man, who had finally come down to live. And as the dawn spread its light across Cedar Ridge, Jonas Mercer knew one thing with certainty. The past would always haunt him, but for the first time in 7 years, the future was his to claim.